17 cents a pound. That was the insultingly low price Abigail Mercer paid for 43 half-dead, squealing runts at the Benton County auction block. Laughter echoed from the bleachers. The local agricultural barons thought she was burying her grandfather's legacy. They didn't know she was planting an empire. Nobody in the Willamette Valley thought Abigail Mercer would last through the autumn, much less the brutal Oregon winter. At 32, she had abandoned a high-rise accounting firm in downtown Portland to return to Oak Haven, a farming community where dirt under the fingernails was the only accepted currency. She hadn't returned for a vacation. She came back to salvage Clark Orchards, the 50-acre farm her grandfather, Alan Clark, had left her when he passed away in a nursing home, his mind clouded by dementia and his bank accounts drained by medical bills. The crown jewel of the Clark property had always been the upper terrace, 20 acres of heirloom snowdrift apples. For 3 generations, those trees had produced the crispest, most sought-after cider apples in the Pacific Northwest. But 5 years ago, a devastating soil disease, a virulent, aggressive strain of armillaria root rot, had swept through the terrace. The fungus had strangled the root systems, turning the once magnificent trees into brittle, blackened skeletons. The locals called it the boneyard. The county extension agent had told Abigail's grandfather to bulldoze the lot, burn the wood, and drench the earth in heavy chemical fungicides. Alan had refused, and the farm had gone bankrupt, waiting for a miracle that never came. Abigail didn't have the money for bulldozers, and she certainly didn't have the capital for commercial fungicides. What she had was exactly $4,200 to her name, and a desperate, borderline insane plan documented in a frayed leather journal her grandfather had kept in the 1970s. That desperation brought her to the Grangeville livestock auction on a damp Tuesday morning in late October. The air inside the cavernous metal building was thick with the smell of sawdust, diesel exhaust, and manure. Seasoned farmers in Carhartt jackets and mud-caked boots leaned against the metal railings, bidding on prime Angus heifers and thick, muscular Yorkshire hogs. Abigail sat alone in the third row, her hands clutching a battered aluminum clipboard. "All right, folks, moving on to lot 42. Barked Bill Crenshaw, the auctioneer, his voice rattling through the distorted PA system. "We got a clean-up lot here, 43 feeder pigs. Mixed breed, mostly Duroc Yorkshire crosses. Now, I ain't gonna lie to you folks, these are the bottom of the barrel. Runts, tail-enders. A few look like they've been chewing on rocks for a month. Sellers just looking to clear the barn. Do I hear 50 cents a pound?" Silence fell over the arena. A few men chuckled. The pigs in the holding pen below were a pathetic sight. They were dangerously underweight, their ribs protruding sharply against pale, pinkish skin stretched taut over knobby bones. Several were coughing, huddled together for warmth on the concrete floor. They were the discards, the pigs that commercial operations threw away, because they would cost more in veterinary bills and feed than they would ever yield in meat. 40 cents, Bill pleaded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Come on, boys, they'll make good dog food if nothing else." 30, Abigail raised her numbered paddle. 17 cents. A collective gasp, followed instantly by a chorus of low, mocking laughter, rolled through the bleachers. Heads turned. Sitting in the front row, flanked by 2 of his foremen, was Harrison Gentry. Harrison was the owner of Gentry Agribusiness, a massive corporate farming operation that had been systematically swallowing up failing family farms in Benton County for a decade. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed silver beard and the kind of expensive Stetson hat that had never seen actual rain. Harrison turned in his seat, leaning an arm over the metal railing to look up at Abigail. A patronizing smirk played on his lips. "Abigail, honey," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "Did you lose your glasses? Those aren't pigs. Those are walking vet bills. You put those sickly things out in the Clark boneyard. The coyotes won't even eat 'em out of pity." A few of the local hands guffawed. Abigail's cheeks flushed hot, but she kept her paddle locked in the air, her eyes fixed entirely on the auctioneer. 17 cents a pound is bid by the little lady from Clark, Bill said, eager to move the dead weight. Do I hear 20? Anybody? Going once? Going twice? Sold. Lot 42 goes to Abigail Mercer for 17 cents a pound. The transaction cost her less than $300. It was a spectacular bargain, but as she backed her rusted 1998 Ford F-250 and a borrowed swaying livestock trailer up to the loading chute, the reality of her purchase settled heavily in her chest. The farmhands who loaded the pigs were careless, prodding the weak, terrified animals with sorting panels. Abigail had to jump into the muck of the chute herself, using her own body to shield a particularly tiny, shivering Duroc mix that had collapsed under the hooves of the others. "Careful," she snapped at a burly yard worker. "They're fragile." "They're dead on arrival, lady," the worker grunted, slamming the metal gate shut. "Hope you know how to dig a mass grave." Oh. As she drove away from the auction house, the rearview mirror framed Harrison Gentry standing by his pristine, heavy-duty truck, shaking his head in mock sorrow as he watched her leave. He had been trying to buy the Clark Boneyard for 3 years. He wanted to rip out the dead trees and pave it over for a massive, climate-controlled, commercial poultry barn. Every time Abigail had refused his lowball offers, his smile had grown a little thinner, a little colder. "Let them laugh," Abigail whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She glanced at the grandfather's journal sitting on the passenger seat. The pages were open to a chapter titled, "Swine as Foresters, the Eradication of Fungal Blight Through Rotational Disturbance. We're going to prove them all wrong." The Clark Boneyard was a bleak, haunting landscape. 20 acres of dead snowdrift apple trees stretched out in perfect, geometric rows under the overcast Oregon sky. Their branches were gnarled and completely devoid of leaves, looking like jagged black veins reaching up to the clouds. The soil beneath them was choked with invasive blackberry brambles, thistle, and a thick, impenetrable layer of hardpan dirt. Beneath that crust lay the invisible enemy, the white, stringy mycelium of the armillaria fungus slowly digesting the rotting roots of the dead orchard. When Abigail opened the trailer gate, the 43 piglets didn't stampede out. They hesitated, sniffing the damp autumn air, trembling. She had to climb into the trailer with a bucket of sweet feed to coax them down the ramp. They were in terrible shape. 2 of them had weeping eyes from a respiratory infection. The smallest one, the little red Duroc she had shielded at the auction house, whom she instantly named Barnaby, was so weak he could barely stand on his spindly legs. Her neighbors thought she was just going to let them loose to die, but Abigail had spent the last 2 weeks stringing miles of polywire electric fencing, sectioning the dead orchard into tight, half-acre paddocks. This was the core of her grandfather's theory, backed by obscure regenerative agriculture papers she had printed out from the Portland Library. If she let the pigs roam the whole 20 acres, they would just eat the easy surface weeds and languish. But if she confined them to small, concentrated areas and moved them every 3 days, their natural behavior would be weaponized. Pigs are nature's plows. When confined and driven by hunger, they will root deep into the earth. Abigail's gamble was that the pigs would not only churn up the suffocating hardpan soil, aerating it and allowing water to penetrate, but that they would actually seek out and consume the rotting, fungus-infected roots of the dead apple trees, effectively sanitizing the soil through their digestive tracts. But to do the heavy lifting of tilling compacted earth, the pigs needed calories, lots of them. And Abigail didn't have the budget for commercial swine feed. The next morning, before the sun even crested the Cascade Mountains, Abigail drove 20 miles to the regional Tillamook dairy processing plant. She had struck a backdoor deal with a shift manager named Dave. Every day, the plant produced thousands of gallons of liquid whey, a byproduct of cheese manufacturing that they usually paid to have hauled away and dumped. For $20 a week, Dave agreed to let Abigail pump 300 gallons of the warm, nutrient-dense whey into a plastic IBC tote in the back of her truck. She mixed the whey with a cheap surplus of rolled barley and expired bakery bread she scavenged from a local commercial bakery outlet. When she poured the thick, sour-smelling slurry into the long plastic troughs in the first paddock, the runts went frantic. The rich, Easily digestible proteins in the whey were a lifeline for their stunted digestive systems. For the first 3 weeks, it was a brutal, muddy war of attrition. The November rains arrived, turning the boneyard into a frigid, knee-deep soup of mud. Abigail lived in her insulated muck boots. She was up at 4 a.m. every day, checking the electric fences, because if the wire grounded out on a wet blackberry bush, the pigs would escape. She spent her evenings in the barn under a heat lamp with a bottle of injectable antibiotics and a syringe, nursing the sickest pigs back from the brink of pneumonia. She lost 3 pigs in the first month, burying them in the cold, unyielding earth behind the barn, tears streaming down her face. She began to wonder if Harrison Gentry had been right all along. Then, just before Thanksgiving, a heavy, imposing black SUV crunched up her gravel driveway. Harrison Gentry stepped out, wearing a thick wool peacoat, stepping carefully to avoid the mud. He found Abigail wrestling a heavy roll of wire fencing near the edge of the orchard. "Abby," Harrison said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I was driving by on the county highway. Saw you out here in the freezing rain. It's breaking my heart, seeing Alan's granddaughter reduce herself to a mud-caked swineherd. I heard you've already got dead pigs rotting behind the barn." Abigail dropped the roll of wire. She wiped a streak of freezing mud from her cheek with the back of a blistered, gloved hand. "You didn't drive all the way out here to check on my health, Harrison." "What do you want?" "I want to save you from bankruptcy," he said smoothly, pulling a folded legal document from his inside pocket. "I'm raising my offer. $800 an acre. That's 16 grand for this useless stretch of deadwood. You can pay off the back taxes, move back to Portland, and put this nightmare behind you. If you don't, the county is going to seize this property by spring for unpaid property taxes anyway. Take the money, Abby." Abigail looked past him, up the hill. The 40 surviving pigs were currently confined to paddock number 4. A profound transformation was happening, though Harrison was too arrogant to look closely. The pigs had recovered from their gaunt, skeletal state. Fueled by the dairy whey, their bodies had filled out with dense muscle and thick layers of insulating fat. But more importantly, they were doing exactly what her grandfather's journal had predicted. Driven by an instinctual craving for the starches trapped in the root systems, the 40 pigs were aggressively excavating the bases of the dead snowdrift apple trees. They had rooted massive craters around the stumps, sometimes 3 feet deep, snapping the diseased roots with their powerful jaws. They were physically ripping the armillaria fungus out of the ground, exposing the subterranean rot to the freezing air and the sterilizing ultraviolet light of the sun. The soil in the paddocks they had already passed through didn't look like barren hardpan anymore. It was dark, rich, deeply churned earth, mixed with thousands of pounds of their nitrogen-rich manure. Abigail looked back at Harrison, her eyes narrowing. $800 an acre is a joke, Harrison, and you know it. Prime agricultural land in Benton County goes for $10,000 an acre. This isn't prime land, Harrison snapped, his mask of politeness slipping. It's a toxic graveyard. You can't grow a weed in that soil without it catching the blight. You're playing in the dirt with a bunch of sickly animals while the bank prepares to foreclose. Get off my land, Abigail said softly, but her voice carried a steely edge that made Harrison take a half step back. And if you ever come onto my property again without an invitation, I'll let you test how well a 40-pound Duroc cross handles a trespasser. Harrison sneered, shoving the contract back into his pocket. You're just as stubborn and foolish as your old man. When the bank auctions this place in April, I'll buy it for pennies. Have fun freezing to death, little girl. He drove away, leaving Abigail standing in the cold rain. She was terrified. Harrison was right about one thing. The property taxes were due in April to the tune of $14,000. Even if the pigs got to market weight by then, 40 hogs at standard commodity prices wouldn't cover half of that debt. She turned and walked up the hill to paddock 4. Barnaby, now a robust, energetic, 80-pound juvenile, trotted up to the fence, his snout completely caked in black, loamy soil. He let out a deep, satisfied grunt Abigail knelt down in the mud, reaching through the hot wire to scratch him behind the ears. As she looked into the deep trench the pigs had dug around the nearest dead tree, she noticed something strange. The pigs hadn't just eaten the rotten roots. They had unearthed something else, buried deep in the subsoil, attached to the few surviving healthy taproots of the heirloom trees, were strange, bulbous nodules. She reached down, pulling a golf ball-sized clump of earth free. She broke it open with her thumbs. Inside the flesh was a marbled, creamy white, giving off an intense, intoxicating aroma of damp earth, garlic, and wild mushrooms. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather hadn't just been growing apples up here. He had been cultivating a secret. And the Runty pigs, mocked by the entire valley, were the only ones who knew how to find it. Feverish excitement replaced the freezing rain sinking into Abigail's bones. She clutched the pale, marbled lump in her muddy gloves like a piece of smuggled gold and sprinted down the slick slope to the farmhouse. Tearing through her grandfather's dusty study, she bypassed the stack of modern agricultural journals and dug into his locked cedar desk. At the very bottom, wrapped carefully in protective oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger dated 1988. Alan Clark hadn't just been growing snowdrift apples. Decades ago, anticipating shifting climate patterns and the notoriously volatile commodity markets that destroyed small farmers, he had taken a massive, unproven risk. He had imported spores of tuber oregnense, the prized, incredibly lucrative Oregon white truffle. He meticulously inoculated the rootstock of the apple trees, knowing that truffles formed a symbiotic mycorrhizal relationship with specific host roots. But when the armillarious blight struck the orchard above ground 5 years ago, the visual devastation had obscured the fortune quietly multiplying below. Truffles are notoriously fickle. They need to be harvested precisely when ripe, releasing volatile compounds that signal their maturity. Human noses are completely blind to these scents under 3 feet of densely compacted earth. But pigs possess olfactory receptors perfectly fine-tuned to the exact sterols produced by ripening subterranean fungi. The arrogant agricultural barons of Benton County had laughed at her runts, but Abigail had accidentally purchased a battalion of the most elite foragers in the culinary world. Training them took less than a week. Barnaby, the little red Duroc, who once couldn't even stand on his spindly legs, became her prodigy, the lead forester of the herd. Abigail would walk him into a fresh paddock, and he would instantly drop his snout, snorting furiously as he scanned the earth. When he caught the scent, his entire body would go rigid before he began to dig with frantic, rhythmic efficiency. Abigail would quickly step in, gently pushing him aside with a handful of fermented barley and molasses, and carefully excavate the remaining dirt with a specialized hand trowel. By mid-January, her commercial walk-in refrigerator, a massive unit previously holding only a few bottles of veterinary antibiotics, was packed with vacuum-sealed bags of fragrant, high-grade white truffles. But finding the buried treasure was only half the battle. She had to sell them rapidly before their volatile aromatic compounds faded into nothingness. She loaded a sample cooler into a rusted Ford truck and drove the long, winding highway to downtown Portland, targeting the most exclusive culinary real estate in the Pacific Northwest. Her primary target was Chef Oliver Caldwell, a notoriously ruthless restaurateur whose establishment commanded a 6-month waiting list and boasted 2 Michelin stars. His purchasing managers initially refused to let a mud-stained farmer, smelling faintly of dairy whey, anywhere near the pristine kitchens. Abigail bypassed the loading dock entirely. She marched directly through the front glass doors of the restaurant during pre-service prep, holding a simple Tupperware container. When a host tried to physically block her, she simply popped the lid. The intoxicating, deeply earthy aroma of raw garlic, toasted hazelnut, and rich forest loam flooded the lobby, instantly overpowering the scent of expensive floor polish. Oliver Caldwell stormed out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a pristine white apron, ready to eviscerate whoever was causing a disturbance in his dining room. He stopped dead in his tracks. He walked slowly toward Abigail, his eyes locked on the cooler. He picked up a golf ball-sized truffle, inspecting the marbled exterior, before using a silver pocket knife to shave a paper-thin slice onto the back of his hand. He tasted it, closing his eyes. $400 a pound, Oliver whispered, opening his eyes wide with shock. I will take every single ounce you can pull from the dirt. Nobody in the Willamette Valley is producing this caliber of quality. Where in God's name did you get these? From a boneyard, Abigail replied, locking eyes with the famous chef. The cash infusion was instantaneous and massive, but secrets bleed quickly in small farming communities. By late February, the cashiers at the local feed store were whispering about Abigail Mercer, paying for premium organic grain in crisp $100 bills. Harrison Gentry, sensing his prized real estate acquisition suddenly slipping away, decided to abandon his patronizing charm and play violently dirty. 2 days after a massive muddy snowmelt, a pristine white truck bearing the Benton County Department of Agriculture seal crawled aggressively up Abigail's driveway. Inspector Richard Hayes, a bureaucratic enforcer known to enjoy regular, fully comped golf outings at Harrison's private country club, stepped out with a heavy metal clipboard. Miss Mercer, we've received multiple anonymous complaints regarding severe biological hazards and animal welfare violations on this property, Hayes announced, refusing to make eye contact as he tapped a pen against his forms. Serious allegations of feeding toxic dairy waste to livestock, housing animals in unsanitary mud pits, and operating an unpermitted black market slaughter operation. I haven't slaughtered a single animal, Abigail shot back, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. I need to inspect the upper terrace immediately, Hayes demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. If I find standing sewage and malnourished livestock, I am authorized by the county to immediately impound the entire herd and place a massive lien on this property for environmental remediation. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She knew exactly what Harrison's strategy was. If the county impounded her pigs, she lost her only harvesters. Without the pigs, the remaining truffles rotted uselessly in the ground. Without the truffle revenue, she would default on the looming April property taxes. Harrison would swoop in, buy the lien for pennies on the dollar, and bulldoze her grandfather's legacy into a corporate parking lot. Panic threatened to choke her, but Abigail simply nodded, her expression hardening into a mask of pure defiance. She gestured for Inspector Hayes to follow her up the steep, muddy incline toward the upper terrace. She prayed the paddocks looked as good to a hostile inspector as they did to her. When they crested the hill and reached the perimeter wire of paddock 7, Hayes stopped writing. His jaw tightened in visible confusion. Instead of a toxic wasteland filled with starving, diseased animals, he found 40 magnificent hogs. The surviving runts were now massive, glistening with vibrant health, their thick winter coats shedding mud effortlessly. Barnaby, standing proudly near the fence line, tipped the scales at well over 200 pounds, a magnificent specimen of muscle and vitality that looked like a completely different species from the shivering creature Abigail had shielded at the auction block. But far more shocking to the inspector was the condition of the soil. The paddocks the pigs had already processed behind them were no longer compacted, dead hardpan choked with invasive weeds. They were beautifully terraced beds of rich, dark, deeply aerated loam. The heavy winter rains, which usually caused catastrophic, muddy runoff on the Clark farm, had soaked perfectly into the sponge-like rehabilitated earth. There was no standing water. There was no foul sewage smell. There was only the clean, crisp scent of raw, living earth breathing for the first time in years. Hayes walked slowly over to a deep trench, bending down to inspect the shredded remains of the diseased root systems. The armillaria fungus. It's completely destroyed here. The soil horizon is turning over. Regenerative rotational grazing, Abigail explained, handing him a thickly bound folder containing printed copies of the federal agricultural guidelines she had rigorously followed. The whey provides necessary probiotic bacteria to their gut microbiome, which they then distribute directly into the soil through their manure. It actively outcompetes and destroys the pathogenic fungus. My animals are heavily nourished, my soil is draining perfectly, and I am in full compliance with every state environmental code. Hayes searched desperately for a violation, pacing the fence line for 20 minutes, but the physical evidence of phenomenal land stewardship was entirely irrefutable. He left without writing a single citation, slamming his truck door in frustration. April arrived with a sudden, beautiful, and unseasonable warmth. The ultimate deadline for the county tax foreclosure was Friday at exactly 5 p.m. On Thursday morning, Abigail walked through the heavy glass doors of the Benton County Treasurer's office. Harrison Gentry was already there, leaning comfortably against the polished mahogany counter, chatting up the county clerk. He held a certified cashier's check in his thick hand, ready to pay the back taxes the very second Abigail defaulted, thereby legally claiming the deed to the Clark farm. He wore a smug, utterly victorious grin as she approached. "Abby," Harrison crowed, checking his heavy gold wristwatch with exaggerated pity. "I admire you sticking it out through the freeze, I really do. You've got grit, but it's time to let the adults handle the land now. You can leave those pigs on the property. I'll have my boys drive them to the commercial slaughterhouse this afternoon. Might get you enough gas money to drive your little rusted truck back to Portland." Abigail completely ignored him. She stepped up to the clerk's window, unzipped her faded canvas tote bag, and pulled out 3 tightly banded stacks of crisp $100 bills. $14,200, the exact amount owed, plus all the late penalties. Harrison's patronizing smile vanished instantly. The color drained completely from his face as the clerk meticulously fed the bills into the counting machine, the rhythmic, mechanical whir echoing loudly in the quiet office. "Where the hell did you get that kind of cash?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "You didn't sell those runts? Pork commodities have been down all quarter." "I didn't sell the pigs, Harrison," Abigail said softly, reaching out to take her heavy, beautifully stamped receipt of ownership from the clerk. "The pigs are my permanent employees, and they earn a hell of a lot more per hour than your farmhands do." She walked out of the courthouse with her head held high, leaving Gentry completely speechless, the heavy brass doors closing firmly on his corporate empire's relentless expansion. When Abigail returned to Oak Haven that afternoon, the sun was shining brightly. She drove her truck straight up to the boneyard, carrying 2 massive buckets of premium sweet feed, mixed with rolled oats and fresh apples, a celebratory feast for her 43 saviors. As she crested the hill and shifted the truck into park, she stopped, her breath catching painfully in her throat. For 5 long, agonizing years, the upper terrace had been a tragic graveyard of blackened dead wood. But the pigs hadn't just eaten the rot and dug up the lucrative truffles. In their relentless, hungry churning, they had pruned away the diseased roots, heavily fertilized the surrounding earth, and allowed crucial water and oxygen to finally reach the deep, healthy taproots that had been slowly suffocating under the hard pan. Scattered entirely across the 20 acres, breaking defiantly through the bleak, charcoal-colored bark of the dead snowdrift apple trees, were tens of thousands of tiny, tight green buds. As the warm afternoon sun hit the slopes, the tight buds rapidly began to open. The dead orchard was blooming white, a stunning, intensely fragrant canopy of brilliant apple blossoms swept across the valley, a magnificent visual miracle proving beyond any doubt that the soil was fully alive again. Barnaby trotted happily up to the fence line, letting out a deep, rumbling grunt. His strong snout covered in rich, black soil. Abigail dropped the heavy buckets and sank slowly to her knees in the soft earth, tears of absolute, overwhelming triumph streaming down her face. She hadn't just saved her grandfather's farm, she had resurrected his dream. The 43 mocked, starving, runty discards hadn't just survived the brutal winter, they had brought the dead back to life. If Abigail's incredible journey of resilience, outsmarting corporate greed, and bringing a dead farm back to life inspired you, please hit that like button right now. We share powerful, real-life stories of triumph against all odds every single week. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring update. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the biggest underdogs can bloom. See you next time.